Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the Survive podcast. And today I'm joined by Dr. Frank Hughes. And today we're going to be discussing the debate between Professor Nina Livesey and Professor Bruce Chilton. So we're going to be reviewing the debate with Frank today. Frank, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
So can you start with by giving us your thoughts on the argumentations that were deployed in the debate?
Okay, let me attempt to do that. I, of course, know Bruce Chilton from, I suppose, the 80s, when I was trying to get my dissertation published in the JS&T supplement series. And he was certainly a source of encouragement then. And I didn't see him this year at SBL, but we had a small conversation last year. So I know Bruce, and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Nina Livesey. Anyway, Professor Livesey says that there is circular reasoning and flawed methodology in the mainstream of Pauline scholarship that holds 7 of the Pauline letters as authentic. And so she talks about that at great length. She goes back to the Dutch radical school, which held the same thing, particularly W.C. van Manen in the 19th century. She also talked about several theories of collection, of, how did the Pauline corpus, or the letters that became the Pauline corpus, how did they get collected and put together as the Pauline corpus? And so she had, I think, 2 or 3 collection theories. And the reality, of course, is that we don't really know how the Pauline letters were collected. And we also don't really know how the Pauline letters were published. And she decries the fact that we don't have external evidence. In other words, third-party evidence that would be outside the Christian tradition or outside the Christian faith that would actually say, yeah, there was Paul and he was an apostle and he founded churches, et cetera, et cetera. So since we don't have that external evidence, external to the Christian church, Christian churches, that is a problem, but it's not an insuperable problem, I would say. She also asked whether Paul kept copies of his letters, and we don't really have evidence of that. Although, if I remember correctly, David Trobish has said something about that. So there were a number of things that were sort of the center of what she argued in her book and that she brought up in the debate. Bruce Chilton, I think, very helpfully located the issue of authentic Pauline letters versus non-authentic Pauline letters within the larger framework of Greco-Roman literature. And this, of course, is where my natural habitat has been. And of course, he did say very memorably, Bruce said that pseudonymity, pseudonymous tendencies were not limited to the New Testament. And I'll talk a little bit about that myself. And he did say that ancient literature floats on a sea of pseudonymity. A wonderful, wonderful sentence. So he talked about pseudonymity in biblical literature and also in Jewish literature outside the Bible, and showed that pseudonymity is very well known. And I also have an article that I wrote in this book was called Rhetorics in the New Millennium, edited by Hester and Hester. And I wrote an article called Pseudonymity as Rhetoric. And I traced pseudonymity in Greco-Roman literature and also in Jewish literature. And also I traced it in terms of Greek and Roman rhetoric. And I can say a little bit more about that today. But basically, what Professor Livesey argued is that the scholarship that is so certain about Paul having written First Thessalonians, Galatians, Corinthians, Philippians, Philemon, and Romans is it's too people are too confident about that. And so she argued that the methodology was flawed in that the reasoning was circular. And so that I think is something that other New Testament scholars will have to take up as well as myself. One of the things that it was appears that Professor Livesey and Professor Chilton agreed on is that we need to embrace pseudonymity. And I agree fully. We who study the Bible, we who study Pauline letters, or the letters of the Pauline corpus, as I'd prefer to say, we need to embrace pseudonymity as a real thing. And I think that much has been written about it, actually, since I did my dissertation in 1984. And so we also need to embrace what could be called pseudo-epistolography, namely the actual reality of people who were probably real people in antiquity, but there were letters written in their names after they died. And so that is known as pseudo-epistolography. And so that certainly is something that more work needs to be done, but more work has been done on it since I did my dissertation in 1984 and since it was published as a book in 1989. Moving the needle a little bit from, okay, we know that Paul wrote these letters and there's no doubt whatsoever. And we've sort of moved the needle away from that and have moved the needle towards, yes, there is biblical pseudonymity in both testaments. And also there is pseudonymity in the Pauline corpus. And I think that is an important move of the needle. And a lot has been written on that. And Professor Chilton referred to Professor Adela Yarborough Collins's book, Paul Transformed, which came out in 2022. And so that's an important thing. And of course, we know the earlier works of Andreas Lindemann, Paulus im Ältesten Christentum, which was a survey of how Paul was received in early Christian literature up through Marcion. And then there was another one on the Catholic side by Ernst Dassmann, Der Stachel im Fleisch, the thorn in the flesh, meaning Paul himself, of course. And it was a survey of how Paul was received in the early Christian literature up through Irenaeus. So a lot has been written, and I think that this is all to the good, because I think that the needle needed to move. We need to embrace the complexity of early Christian literature, and why not start with the Pauline corpus? We've already embraced the complexity of early Christian writings with respect to the Gospels, right? Surely we know with respect to the Gospels that there is some material that is likely to go closer back to the historical Jesus. And then there is some material that few, if any, would argue goes back to the historical Jesus. So if you have some material in the Gospels that is, shall we say, hardcore Jesus, and then you have some material in the Pauline corpus that is hardcore Paul, then it seems to me that we're in a better position, because we're willing to really take a good look at the whole issue of how complex early Christian communities were, and therefore how complex the writings of early Christian communities were, as indeed they were likely to be.
What would you say is probably the strongest argument that the letters thought to be genuine are authentic to Paul?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that when you look at the historical letters, and I certainly believe that First Clement was written, it could very well have been written in 95, 97, that kind of thing, that, Lightfoot's date for First Clement. There's nothing really that speaks against that. However, as Larry Wellborn has shown, it could be as late as 110, 120. It has to do with the writing of First Clement, and I suppose it has to do with the dating of Clement of Rome, Bishop of Rome, who, according to tradition, is the fourth Bishop of Rome. But I would want to look at not only the historicity of the letters of the Pauline corpus, going back to the first century, if they were from Paul, and Paul, if the usual dating of Paul, like Bob Jewett's date and like Gerard Ludeman's dates and like Alfred Sewell's dates and other dates, Douglas Campbell too. If those dates are reasonable dates, as I believe they are, then you've got a first century Paul. And then the Deutero-Pauline letters, like the earliest Deutero-Pauline letter, Colossians, which is a kind of a Gnosticizing Paulinism, and then Ephesians, which is a rewrite of Colossians, most likely. And then, as I argued, Second Thessalonians is a right-wing reaction to the Gnosticizing tendencies of Colossians and Ephesians, and that theology is what is being attacked in Second Thessalonians, where it says, "Don't listen to anybody by a logos or a spirit or a letter as from us." A letter as from us would mean a letter purporting to be a Pauline letter. So I don't feel the need to date that in the first century. It could very well be in the second century. And there's no quotation or allusion to Second Thessalonians until Polycarp's letter to the Philippians, which I would date around 130. So given the fact that there were these early Christian communities, and given the fact that in the second century, early Christian writers who considered themselves very much in the Pauline tradition wrote these new letters of Paul. They wrote these new letters purporting to be from Paul. In other words, pseudonymous Pauline letters. And they did this in the early second century, possibly in the late first century, the very late first century. They not only imitated, and then of course later, Ignatius of Antioch, on the way to his martyrdom in Rome, he sees himself as a Pauline imitator, imitating the martyrdoms of Paul and Peter. And so why would there be this strong impetus to kind of reconfigure the theology of Paul and to add to the letters of Paul, if the letters of Paul did not actually exist in the first century? In other words, Colossians and Ephesians and Second Thessalonians, being pseudonymous, the pastorals as well, they are imitations of Pauline letters. Why would they be imitating Pauline letters if Pauline letters never existed? And if the letters of Paul were not so heavily identified with Paul himself in a variety of early Christian traditions? The other thing is the Deutero-Pauline letters are very different from each other. Certainly, Colossians is kind of different than Ephesians. But Colossians goes on to say, like in First Colossians chapter 1, 13 and 14, suggests that we are up there with the risen Christ in heaven, right? We're already up in heaven. And then later it says, okay, if you are risen with Christ, why do you act as if you're still on the earth? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle. These are earthly rules. Why are you following earthly rules? And so you have a kind of a Gnosticizing Paulinism in Colossians. And you have a good bit of that is picked up by Ephesians. And the writer of Ephesians seems to have a copy of Colossians. And then I argued in the dissertation that Second Thessalonians was kind of a right-wing, strongly apocalyptic attack on Ephesians and Colossians as pseudonymous letters as from Paul. And so why would there be in the second century or the late first century, why would there be the impetus to imitate Paul and imitate Pauline letters unless it was in fact Pauline letters that were so heavily identified in early Christian tradition with the real historical Paul, who was heavily identified as the founder of churches. So you have Paul as founder of churches. That's exclusive of Pauline letters, right? People in Pauline churches identified Paul as their founder. And most of the time they were proud of that. And so you have this whole early Christian tradition pointing backwards to Paul, most likely in the first century. And so the question is whether you think that that early Christian tradition in the early second century and probably the late first century, if that is a reasonable tradition that is pointing back to the middle first century when Jesus lived and when Paul lived. So I see that you have to not just look at letters, you have to also look at early Christian churches who were, for the most part, very proud of Paul. Especially, they were proud of Paul after his martyrdom. Now, the Corinthian church, part of the Corinthian church was not proud of Paul during his lifetime, of course. And that's why Paul has to keep writing all those Corinthian letters. But after Paul's death, early Christian congregations, which had been founded by the preaching of Paul, they are proud of their founding apostle. So that's a historical tradition that exists separately from the letters.
So in other words, you're saying that the fact that when you look at Second Thessalonians, it's dismissing other letters and saying, don't listen to those other letters as if it came from us. Right. Another way of looking at it is, okay, so Second Thessalonians is dismissing the authenticity of First Thessalonians and or other Pauline epistles that are written prior. So you're saying it would sound a little weird if it turned out that Second Thessalonians was just dismissing other letters that are pseudonymous, not attributed to Paul, or not. Excuse me. Let me rephrase that were attributed to Paul, but weren't actually by Paul either.
Well, I don't think that Second Thessalonians is dismissing First Thessalonians. That would be very difficult because so much of First Thessalonians is quoted and alluded to, as the great William Vrede showed in about 1901 in his book Die Echtheit des Zweiten Thessalonicher Brief. He put First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians in parallel columns like a gospel synopsis, and he showed a bunch of Second Thessalonians as being very, very parallel to First Thessalonians. And so most of us who think that Paul didn't write Second Thessalonians, as far as I know, all of us think that the writer of Second Thessalonians quoted and alluded to First Thessalonians because he thought it was indeed really by Paul. but I think what is being dismissed and what is being refuted, to use a rhetorical term, is the fulfilled eschatology type of Paulinism that you surely see in Colossians, and you probably do see in Ephesians. So the people that are saying this are saying the day of the Lord has already come. And so I argued in my book, Early Christian Rhetoric and 2 Thessalonians, that 2 Thessalonians was sort of a right-wing attack on a kind of a left-wing Paulinism that is represented by Colossians and Ephesians. So I don't see 2 Thessalonians as a refutation of 1 Thessalonians.
So what I'll do is I'll rephrase my question without putting it like that. So basically what you're saying is it would be strange if 2 Thessalonians was dismissing other Pauline epistles, whatever Pauline epistles it was talking about, if there were no Pauline epistles that went back to Paul at all.
That's right. You don't tell children not to put beans in their ears, right? You don't go into a refutation, which is, that's a big rhetorical term right there. You don't go into refutation if there's nothing to refute. You don't go writing letters that invent conflicts within Pauline churches if those conflicts didn't exist.
What do you think was the strongest argument that Nina used during the debate?
I think that I'm going to have to, I've gotten her book and I've thumbed through it and read bits and pieces of it. And I think that I'm going to have to look at what she says about the Dutch radical school. In other words, Van Manen and Bruno Bauer and Rudolf Steck, I believe. I'm going to have to look at that. And also I'm going to have to look at what she says about the more conventional arguments in favor of Pauline letters being authentically by Paul, and see if I think that the reasoning is really that circular. I'm going to have to look at that carefully, and it certainly bears being looked at very carefully. I think that we should all be very grateful to her, because her book is brilliantly documented, and beautifully presented, and I think probably well argued. And of course, you don't know if it's really well argued until you really work through it. But the real question that sticks in my mind from her book is just how circular is the reasoning, that people who believe in the authentic Pauline letters being authentic, is that really circular reasoning? And is that really a flawed methodology? That bears looking at very carefully. And I would sort of contrast that with the whole question of, okay, if you're not sure that Paul wrote these letters that most of us think Paul wrote and have always thought that Paul wrote, except for the Dutch radical school, if you're willing to doubt the authenticity of, let's say, the 4 big ones, the 4 Hauptbriefe, according to Bauer, then are you going to then doubt the authenticity of Quintilian's Institutio Oratoria being by Quintilian, the most famous Latin rhetorical teacher? Given the fact that in Cicero you have the Cicero's, it was called the Rhetorica Secunda, and it was called the Rhetorica ad Herennium. And we don't think that Cicero wrote the Rhetorica ad Herennium, but we do think that Cicero wrote the De Inventione, and we do think that Cicero wrote his many letters, and we do think that Cicero wrote the other rhetorical works such as Brutus and Orator, and we do think that Cicero wrote the Catiline orations. And we do think that he wrote the letters to Atticus and the letters to his brother. And we now have really good texts of those. When you look at Aristotle, we think that Aristotle wrote all of Aristotle, with some exceptions. We think that Aristotle wrote the art of rhetoric, but we don't think that Aristotle wrote the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum. You can also believe that Aristotle wrote the art of rhetoric and see differences between books 1 and 2, which are much more philosophically based, and then book 3 of the art of rhetoric, which is more based in traditional rhetorical teaching. So you can make distinctions within classical authors in terms of what they argue and how they argue it. And some classical authors it has been argued that there is pseudonymous material. For example, here I have a book that's called The Letters of Demosthenes, and by Jonathan Goldstein. And he argued that several of the letters of Demosthenes were in fact by Demosthenes. Previous classical scholarship had argued that they were not by Demosthenes. And he did a rhetorical analysis of, I think, letter 1 and letter 3 and letter 4, and showed how letter 1 conformed beautifully to rhetorical tradition in terms of the rhetorical tradition of the putting together of a speech. And in chapter 2 of my dissertation, The Rhetoric of Letters, that's what the chapter was called. I ended that chapter with a rhetorical analysis of Demosthenes' letter 1, and showed that it had a rhetorical structure which you could very easily understand. So if you're gonna be very, very choicey about Pauline letters, which are almost unanimously thought of as being by Paul himself, and have been almost unanimously thought of as being by Paul himself for a long time, including in the early church. If you're going to raise a lot of hell about that, then we ought to start raising a lot of hell about Cicero and Demosthenes and Aristotle and any other classical authors you might name. How do we have these works from classical authors? We have these works because we have the letters of Demosthenes and the speeches of Demosthenes, because they were preserved in rhetorical schools. And the speeches of Demosthenes were used as textbooks in rhetorical schools. See? And so it was rhetorical schools that preserved much of the Demosthenic corpus. Was Quintilian's institution of rhetoric, institution of oratory, how was that preserved? Well, the most important people who would have preserved Quintilian would have been people who were interested in the tradition of rhetoric, and that would have included rhetorical schools and rhetorical teachers. And so if rhetorical teachers and rhetorical schools could preserve Demosthenes and Quintilian and maybe Cicero's De Inventione, for example, and create the Rhetorica ad Herennium by pseudo-Cicero, and create the Rhetorica ad Alexandrum by pseudo-Aristotle, and create the pseudo-Quintilian declamations as part of their rhetorical tradition. Why is it extremely remarkable that in the tradition of Pauline churches, you would have some material that is very likely to have come from Paul, and then other material that is likely not to have come from Paul? For example, the pastoral epistles. So I think that when you look at how diverse rhetorical schools were, and it's believed that rhetorical schools were pretty much all around the Mediterranean Sea, right? And when you look at the diversity of philosophical schools, and by the way, a philosophical sect was called a hieresis, which is the same word that is used for Christian sects. See? So you're looking at a very diverse tradition of philosophical schools and rhetorical schools that are probably the major people that preserved philosophical writers and rhetorical writers, and people who were not rhetorical writers but were rhetorical speech makers like Cicero. And so I think that you have to really look very carefully at how philosophical writings were preserved and how rhetorical writings were preserved, not only speeches, but also letters and also handbooks of rhetoric. They were preserved in a variety of ways and under a variety of names. And so, given that fact, it doesn't bother me that you have some diversity in the Pauline corpus. Namely, you have authentic letters, and of course, Bob Jewett and I argued for 8 original Corinthian letters and letter fragments preserved and edited in 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And then you have the other authentic letters, and then you have probably the first Deutero-Pauline letter, Colossians, and then one very much like it, Ephesians, and then a reaction against that, as I have argued, 2nd Thessalonians. And then the next generation is trying to say, okay, let's make a go of this church thing. And in order to make a go of this church thing, let's talk about how the church has to be structured in order for the church to survive. And so in 1 Timothy and Titus, you have a structure of the church that doesn't have apostles in it anymore because the apostles are dead. And you have a more hierarchical structure where you have one bishop per church, presbyters, and diaconoi. And then in 1 Timothy, you also have widows. So basically, 1 Timothy and Titus certainly look like it's really the next generation trying to carry forward the Pauline tradition and also to shape that tradition in certain ways. And they're trying to shape it not so much in a theological way, speaking of 1 Timothy and Titus, but they're trying to shape it in terms of church order, in terms of if everybody gets to do any damn thing they want to do, the church will die. And so you've got to bring some order put some order into the chaos. And so that's what 1 Timothy and Titus try to do.
I'm going to take the super chat question. Mike Lee, thank you for your super chat. What is the first external evidence for Paul? Dr. Livesey seemed to put that well into the 2nd century.
It depends on when you date 1 Clement. If you date 1 Clement, as Professor Lightfoot did, Professor and Bishop Lightfoot did, you would have it in the last decade, in the last 5 years of the 1st century. And if that date is correct, that means that that is external evidence of the letters of Paul. You ask about the first external evidence for Paul, but I'm talking about the first external evidence for the letters of Paul, and that would be 1 Clement, depending on when you date 1 Clement. If you date it a little bit later, you could date it as late as maybe 110, 120. That would be the early 2nd century. And that is external evidence for the letters of Paul. And also, when you look at other writers in the Apostolic Fathers, depends on when you date them in the Apostolic Fathers in the 2nd century. But again, the external evidence might very well be the pastoral letters, and letters like Ephesians and Colossians, where Paul is being imitated. Would you really want to imitate somebody who never existed?
I'm going to take a non-super chat question now real quick. Let's see here. Let's take this one. DBK says, Dr. Hughes, it seems like you interpret Paul and Christianity through the lens of Irenaeus over Origen. Wouldn't a Origen-oriented view paint a very different picture?
Well, I'm pretty sympathetic to Origen, and even more sympathetic to his predecessor in the Alexandrian catechetical school, Clement of Alexandria. So I don't think that you have to interpret I don't think that you have to use any one lens to interpret Paul or Christianity. I think you have to look at the diversity of Christianity in the second century. I mean, the name of the game about second century Christianity is just how diverse it is.
Mike8903, thank you for your super chat. When First Clement talks about heroes of our generation referring to Paul's death, what did he mean by this? How long would a generation have been to someone in the first century?
Well, I don't know. I would have to look that word up and, look it up not only in Bauer-Danker, but also because it's in the Apostolic Fathers. So you could look it up in Bauer-Danker, but you would have to look it up in the Patristic Greek Lexicon, and especially Little Scott Jones, and to see how that word was used. I think you'd have to look at see how that word was used in historical writings. So I don't know. That would be something that would be worth taking a look at.
So now I want to move on to the chronology and the 7 authentic letters of Paul. What chronological anchors in those letters would you say is very powerful evidence for their authenticity? I guess to get started, I could bring up a couple of things that you could continue from, like Galatians appearing to have been written when when James was alive, or very close to when he was alive, and 2 Corinthians mentioning King Aretas.
Well, yeah, King Aretas. You have the Aretas datum, which was a point of contention between Robert Jewett and Gerd Ludemann. And of course, I did the dissertation with Bob Jewett, and then my Fulbright year was with Gerd Ludemann. So they disagreed on that one. But of course, in Galatians, in chapter 2, you have a narration, a narratio, of what happened at the conference in Jerusalem. And so the Jerusalem conference has been dated at about the year 50 by Jewett. Ludemann wants to date it earlier, as he wants to date everything earlier. But that's a chronological thing right there. But when it is mentioned that you have James, the brother of the Lord, whom obviously Paul met and whom obviously Paul listened to, it is, by the way, very interesting that in Acts 15, you don't have any direct quote from Paul, but you do have direct quotes from Peter and James, but not a word. Paul talked to them, but there's no direct quote from Paul. Kind of interesting, wouldn't that be, if the writer of Acts was a protege of Paul? But you do have the mention of Peter, not only at the Jerusalem conference and what he said, but also after the narration of the Jerusalem conference in Galatians 2, you have the Antioch incident, where Paul says, I opposed him to his face, for he was clearly in the wrong. So that, I think, is a pretty good chronological anchor point. If you think that the Apostle Peter really existed. I suppose you could argue that nobody in antiquity existed, but I think that Peter did exist. I think Paul did exist. And they had histories that the early church was really very interested in. And that's why they preserved as much of the writings of Paul as they could. Paul was an authority figure, and they added, obviously, to Paul's letters by writing the Deuteropauline and pastoral letters. So these people are authority figures. And so if these people were not authority figures in early Jesus believing communities, why would it be even remotely interesting to write a history or a quasi-history like Acts is of what was said in Jerusalem way back when?
I want to go back to Second Thessalonians. You brought up earlier that Second Thessalonians is warning other people of pseudonymous Pauline epistles and to ignore them. Doesn't Second Thessalonians portray a different eschatology about the second coming of Jesus that's distinct from First Thessalonians and other things that Paul says about it in his other letters?
Yes. In First Thessalonians, it says that there will be no signs preceding the coming of the second coming of Jesus. And you have a lot of information about the second coming of Jesus in First Thessalonians 4:13 to 5:3, the third proof of that letter. Whereas in Second Thessalonians, you have an apocalyptic timetable in chapter 2, verses 3 through 12. And in the apocalyptic timetable, it gives you signs that have to have taken place before the day of the Lord can be understood to have come. So you have a very different eschatology in Second Thessalonians than in First Thessalonians. I would say a diametrically opposed eschatology in Second Thessalonians and versus First Thessalonians. Ironically, First Thessalonians is used as a literary source.
Do you think it could be possible, or plausible, I should say, that Second Thessalonians was saying to ignore Pauline epistles because is trying to say to ignore Pauline epistles that present a different eschatology about the second coming of Jesus, which would suggest it's trying to distinguish itself from some or all of the 7 letters of Paul, the genuine letters?
I argued back in the 80s that Second Thessalonians was written against people who were writing pseudonymous Pauline letters that had a fulfilled eschatology, like Colossians and Ephesians. But I don't think that the writer of Second Thessalonians would take the enormous leap to try to refute anything of value, anything that was said in any of the authentic letters. He only says that there are these people that are saying by a letter as from us that the day of the Lord has already come. But that doesn't say anything about any of the letters that are not really taken up massively with the eschaton. So I don't see a rhetoric in Second Thessalonians against all Pauline letters, but I see it as a pretty damaging rhetoric within that part of Pauline Christianity against a particular left wing, so to speak, understanding of Paul that says we're already up with Christ in heaven. In other words, everything that is supposed to take place with the complete union of Christ with believers, all of that stuff, that has already taken place because we're already really with Christ in heaven. The writer of Colossians seems to know the stuff about the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians 12 and or perhaps Romans 12, where it talks about we Christians are part of the body of Christ. And then, of course, in Romans 6, you have we were co-buried with Christ in baptism, so that as Christ was raised by the glory of the Father, we too might walk in newness of life. Okay, well, the idea is we are sort of in Christ, and as Christ has been raised, we are raised. You take that one step further, as Christ is now in the heavenly places, then that means that Christians have to be up there in the heavenly places. Now, Paul doesn't say that. However, the writer of Colossians certainly does say that, and probably Ephesians says that as well. So in other words, they sort of took Paul's understanding of the identification of the believer with Christ and being part of the body of Christ, incorporated into the body of Christ through baptism. Now that Christ is in heaven, that means we're in heaven too. That's why Colossians can say, if you are risen with Christ, seek the things that are above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. And don't worry about earthly rules anymore. They're irrelevant. So I don't see that anywhere else. I don't see that anywhere in the authentic letters of Paul, but I sure do see it in Colossians.
So now I want to go back to First Clement. Which Pauline epistles does First Clement seem to know?
Well, let me look here. He certainly knows First Corinthians, and he certainly knows certainly knows Hebrews. And then there are others. Wait a minute. There are others, but mostly First Corinthians and Hebrews. And then you do have some allusions to Galatians. You may have an allusion to Ephesians, although that's not clear. But the main ones that he knows are Romans, First Corinthians, and Galatians and Hebrews. And the rest are not so much necessarily absolutely positively quotes, but are very interesting allusions.
Well, while you're looking at that, I'll ask in the interim, can you tell us about First Clement appearing to know First Corinthians but not Second Corinthians?
Yes, that has been well documented in the famous article by Günter Bornkamm, Die Vorgeschichte der sogenannten Zweiten Korintherbrief, Zweiten Korintherbrief. He argues that there's absolutely no knowledge of Second Corinthians, and other scholars have agreed with that. So there's no quotes from Second Corinthians in First Clement, as there are indeed quotes from First Corinthians in First Clement.
And what about the other authentic letters of Paul? Does First Clement seem to know them too?
Well, I'm looking in the index here on page 790. Wait a minute, 794 of Holmes's edition. It's clear that he knows Romans. It's clear that he knows First Corinthians. And I've checked out these quotes. None from Second Corinthians. It looks like there are some, perhaps, from Galatians. It looks like there are echoes, as Robert Grant said, of Ephesians. I don't see anything, well, possibly something from Philippians, but I don't see anything from Colossians or First Thessalonians or Second Thessalonians, and certainly nothing from the pastorals. But there certainly are a number of allusions to chapters 1, 2, and 3 of the letter to the Hebrews that are quoted in First Clement.
Does First Clement use the Greek word epistolon at all when referring to anything that Paul wrote?
What, epistole or? Gosh, I think
Does he?
so. Sure.
I think he does at least once to refer
Well,
to a single.
it's a very common word. It means letter.
Yeah. The
It's
reason
a
I
very
asked that question is to show, just to make the point to the audience that Clement doesn't just give allusions, but he directly says he knows a written text by Paul. That's why.
well,
I
I
brought
think
that up.
so. And I think the whole issue of it does say that, he wrote you. I don't remember if he uses the word epistolae, but I would be surprised if he didn't. Let me see. Well, we would have to look that up. And the easy way to look that up would be to look up epistolae in Bauer, Arndt, Gingrich, or Bauer Danker, because Bauer, BAG, and Bauer Danker not only give you the word entries for the words in the New Testament, but also the Apostolic Fathers. Very easy to look up.
Well, in the meantime, I want to go back to the dating of the 7 letters. What determines that they should be dated specifically from the 30s to the 50s, or somewhere around there? What other reasons are used for that?
Well, you have one or two other pieces of data, the most important of which is the Gallio inscription, where Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, and we have that inscription, and we know what year that was. And one of Paul's letters says that Gallio was the proconsul. So one of the Pauline letters mentions Gallio, and since we have the Gallio inscription that says what year he was the proconsul, that's a very strong. That is the hardest piece of evidence there is in dating Pauline letters. The other thing is the early church tradition about the death of Paul during the time of Nero, the emperor, and that is a very believable tradition. And Bob Jewett, in his very detailed chronology book, he dates that in the year 62, but it would be somewhere between 61 and 64 that Paul was martyred, according to early Christian tradition. If you don't believe that Paul was martyred in Rome or outside Rome, then frankly, you have no idea when Paul was martyred. Then, I mean, if you throw out the evidence, you have no evidence. So the other thing is we look for the internal evidence within the letters. And in particular, it is of great importance when you look at 1 Thessalonians to realize that there is no identification in the epistolary prescript of Paul as an apostolos. He sort of buries it down in the narration. But he doesn't say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to you guys in Thessaloniki. So he doesn't make use of his official title up at the very beginning of the letter, as you would really expect him to, form critically. And then there's also no quotation from the Old Testament in 1 Thessalonians. There's also no evidence of the circumcision controversy. There's also no evidence of that part of the circumcision controversy, namely the dichotomous pair of flesh versus spirit. And Bob Jewett, in his dissertation, Paul's Anthropological Terms, published in 1971, he argued that the flesh versus spirit had its beginnings in the circumcision controversy, of which we see so much of in Galatians, and that the original meaning of flesh in Paul was the circumcised flesh of the foreskin. But there's not the slightest trace of flesh versus spirit. There's not the slightest trace of a circumcision controversy. There's not the slightest trace of a controversy over Paul's apostleship. There's also not the slightest trace of Paul having anything particular to do with Jews, because in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, he says, you, the recipients of the letter, you turn to God from idols to serve the living and true God and to await his Son from heaven, Jesus, who saves us from the wrath that is coming. And so if you can take Paul at his word in 1 Thessalonians 1:9, where he says, you, Thessalonians, turn to God from idols, unless you think Paul would say that Judaism was idol worship. I don't believe that. So basically, Paul is writing to a completely Gentile congregation in Thessalonica. His apostleship is not in question. The problem that he deals with is, what do you do about people in the congregation that have died? Are they going to miss the day of the Lord? Are they going to miss the second coming of Jesus? And so that's what he writes about in the third proof. And so also, there is not the slightest trace of justification by faith in 1 Thessalonians. That is the biggest of big deals in Pauline theology. When you don't have justification by faith, and you don't have the circumcision controversy, which may very well have given rise to justification by faith, that is proof very positive, really, of that being the earliest Pauline letter, in my estimation. And I'm joined in that by Robert Jewett, Carl Donfried, Raymond Collins, Wilhelm Wöllner, a whole bunch of other people, that we don't see justification by faith in 1 Thessalonians. And then, of course, when you look at Galatians, then you see the introduction of justification by faith with the quotations from Genesis and so forth. And so that is the really big shift, is between 1 Thessalonians, which is an epidactic letter. Paul is not opposing opponents. Whereas in Galatians, Paul is opposing opponents. And he's really he's not really defending himself in Galatians. He's really prosecuting Peter. So Galatians is a big, big shift between 1 Thessalonians and Galatians. And so it's very important chronologically to put 1 Thessalonians first for the reasons I stated. And then you can see what a big shift it is and what a big theological step it was for Paul to have constructed justification by faith, which is there in Galatians. And of course, he actually goes so far as to say that Gentile Christian believers are actually sons of Abraham, and are actually sons and daughters of Abraham, because Abraham is our father in faith. And of course, he expands that in Romans 4, where Abraham is our father in faith, and that we Gentile Christian believers are sons and daughters of Abraham, just like Jews who are believers in Christ are as well. So you need to put 1 Thessalonians first, and then you need to put Galatians. And then after that, you can put the Corinthian correspondence, which probably took several years, depending on how fast letters can come to and from Corinth, and how many letters you think they were. And then later, Paul was incarcerated once, according to Acts. And then, of course, Paul, in Romans 15, he has his travel plans where he says, I've done everything that I want to do this far east, and now I want to go west. And he says, I've made the circle of the gospel as far as Illyricum, and I want to come to you in Rome on the way to Spain. And so Paul writes the letter to the Romans in order to get together support for his mission to Spain, because Paul needed letters of recommendation, and he sure as hell needed money, because he would have had to hire interpreters. And so, given what he says about his travel plans in Romans chapter 15, verses 40 and following, you need to put Romans as a relatively late Pauline letter, as I would believe the latest Pauline letter. Paul is not in jail when he wrote Romans, whereas Paul is in jail when he wrote Philippians. So basically, you can, in order to figure out dates, then you have to figure out when Paul traveled to certain churches, when that was, because Paul has to travel to a church. And then after he travels to the church, and then he goes to another church, and then there's problems in the first church, then he has to write them a letter to straighten them out. So it is based on your understanding of the travels of Paul. And the problem is with Acts is you got Paul going to Jerusalem too many times.
And for my final question, some interpret 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16 as a reference to the destruction of the temple in 70 CE or 80. And some will say that this is because this is an interpolation. It was put into 1 Thessalonians by a later redactor. Or this is evidence that Paul didn't write it. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I've said in print that Paul did write it, because in my article, which I think you have a copy of, The Rhetoric of 1 Thessalonians, I argued very broadly and specifically that 1 Thessalonians follows the tradition of epideictic rhetoric. And in epideictic rhetoric, you not only have the topics of praise, and which is what Paul uses in the rest of the letter big time, but also you have the rhetoric of blame or vituperation. And so he argues against people who have opposed his mission. And he says some very, very unfortunate and difficult things against Jews in 1 Thessalonians 2:13-16. However, I'm not convinced that the difficulty of 2:13-16 qualifies it to be thought of as an interpolation. But a lot has been written on that. Raymond Collins wrote about 1 million articles, well, not 1 million, but many articles, dozens, on 1 Thessalonians, and he argued that it was an authentic Paul part of 1 Thessalonians. Bob Jewett argued that in his book, and others. Most scholars have argued that it is an authentic Paul part of 1 Thessalonians. And Bob, in his Thessalonian book, said he fervently wished that Paul had not written it. And I think I can agree with that. But I don't see any reason to toss it out, because Paul said something very, very polemical against people who were opposing his mission. I think Paul was very, very capable of doing that. But it also fits the genre of epideictic rhetoric, as I've argued in my article in 1990.
I'd like to let everyone know real quick the link to purchase Frank Hughes' book, The Corinthian Correspondence, is in the description below, and it will also be in the pinned comment. And with that being said, Frank, thank you very much for joining me today.
You're very welcome. Well, I have to do some other things, and I've got to go bake a cake for my niece to take to a funeral tonight. So I've got to get into the kitchen.
All right, Frank, thanks again.
Thank you.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.